Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of St John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. And welcome here to the Bible study couch, where we are going to wrap up our Bible study series on the Table of Nations by looking at the Semitic people, or the descendants of Shem. So if you haven't watched my videos on the Japhethic people and the Hamitic people, I'd recommend you go and watch those first. There's a lot of context there. Essentially, the point of this video series is to just look at the divisions of the sons of Noah and the grandchildren of Noah post the Tower of Babel, when they all went and spread out. The Table of Nations given in Genesis 10. So we're up now to the Semitic people, or the descendants of Shem. Now, Shem's descendants seem to isolate themselves around the Tigris and the Euphrates. So what is interesting is that when you looked at how the other sons of Noah spread out, Japheth in the Bible is called the people of the coastlands, and now this would mainly be talking about the Mediterranean. However, as we know from the fact that some of the sons of Japheth are connected with Mount Ararat and the Caucasus regions, that would also include the Caspian and the Black Seas, not just the Mediterranean Sea. So Japheth's children, they hugged originally the coastlands around the Mediterranean, the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and probably from there later spread out into Europe and Asia. Then we also had the descendants of Ham, who kind of hung around the Jordan River in the Lebanon, and around that area of Canaan, later Israel, and also they hugged kind of the Nile River, being Egypt, Cush, Ethiopia, that area. And that would later spread out from there. I mean, some of Ham's descendants probably went along the Mediterranean, the south of the Mediterranean, along what we'd call North Africa, and so that's originally where they established, and they spread out from there. You do have Nimrod, one of Ham's descendants, living around the Tigris and Euphrates in the land of Shinar and Babylon, but other than that, Ham's descendants were at the Jordan River and the Nile River, whereas Shem's descendants really hung around the Tigris and the Euphrates. And it's from the people of Shem that we get the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and also even the Indians, as we're going to talk about. Via Abraham, which is one of the descendants of Shem, we also get those who inhabit Arabia. Although, as I talked about in my previous video, Josephus and them seems to connect Arabia, particularly South Arabia, so around Saudi Arabia, Yemen. The original inhabitants there being Hamitic peoples, generally descendants of Cush, so relatives to the Ethiopians. Yet later, as history goes on, particularly around the days of Jacob, Esau, that you have even up to the days of Moses and beyond, you have the Midianites, the Edomites, the Ishmaelites, the Amalekites, and all these people that are descended from either Ishmael or Edom, or the Midian and the children of Keturah and Abraham, that you have these Abrahamic peoples that kind of took over Arabia, all the way from North Arabia to South Arabia. So kind of the whole Arabian Peninsula originally was inhabited and settled by Hamitic peoples, and then later got taken over by Semitic peoples as the descendants of Abraham moved into that area. So kind of what we call the Arabian people, the Arabic people these days, they're kind of descended from the other children of Abraham, your non-Israelites, and they essentially wiped out the original Hamitic peoples, who were closely related to the Ethiopians. They were Cushite peoples. They were descended from Cush. So essentially, Arabia, once upon a time, kind of prior to Abraham, so we're looking at 2000s BC, were originally inhabited by Cushite peoples, people who are much closer ethnically to your modern-day Ethiopians, and then from the days of Abraham through to the modern era, they were later those Hamitic peoples were later wiped out by the Semitic descendants of Abraham and the non-Israelite children. So your Ishmaelites, your Edomites, and your children of Keturah. They went out and settled what is the land of Arabia. So your Arabs or your Arabic people, they are Abrahamic peoples. Which is interesting because Abraham, you know, Abram, as his name was previously, Abraham, Abram, Arab, you can kind of see you can see somewhat of a connection there in the words. And they essentially wiped out the original Hamitic Cushite peoples that were there. Now maybe some of them stayed. Josephus does kind of suggest that the people that we today would call the Yemenis, your people of Yemen, may have been kind of the remnants of these original Hamitic peoples that didn't get kind of wiped out by all the Semitic peoples, or maybe they intermarried with the Semitic peoples. I mean, there's a lot of intermarriage going on. I mean, Moses himself, he had 2 wives. One was a Midianite and one was a Cushite. So Moses, who was an Israelite, married a Midianite. So that's one of the descendants of Abraham and Keturah. And then he also had a wife who was a Cushite or an Ethiopian. So Moses, an Israelite or a Hebrew, the ancestors of the Jews, also had a wife who was an ancestor of Arabs and a wife who was an ancestor of the Ethiopians. So there's a lot of intermarriage going on. Throughout the Old Testament, you know, there's Uriah the Hittite. The Hittites were Canaanite peoples, which were also meant they were darker skinned. There's also Rahab, the prostitute. She was a Canaanite. So she was also a darker skinned. She intermarried into the Israelites. So there's a lot of intermarriage going on. Not just between the Hamitic and the Semitic peoples, although that seems to be a lot. I mean, Solomon himself, Solomon had an Egyptian wife. The Egyptians were Hamitic peoples as well, so they would have been darker skinned. I mean, a lot of their paintings in the pyramids paint them with a lot browner, redder skins, but that could have just been the art and the kind of paints they were using. I mean, it doesn't just. The ancient Egyptians were descended from the second son of Ham, so it doesn't mean they had to be as dark as the Ethiopians, who were descended from Cush, the original, the firstborn son of Ham. So, I mean, you know, between different sons, there could be lighter and darker skin tones, but the ancient Egyptians seem to be a lot darker. And there does seem to be a lot of intermarrying between the Semitic peoples and the Hamitic peoples. Not so much in the days of the Old Testament was there a lot of intermarrying between the Japhethic and Semitics. I mean, you do later. You get the Median Persian Empire, and as we point out in the first Bible study, and we'll point this out again, the Persians were descended from the Elamites. We're about to talk about them in a minute, but the Medians, or the Medes, were descended from Mada, one of the sons of Japheth. So when you get the Persian Median Empire merging, you're now getting a mixing of Semitic people and Japhethic people. Yeah, I mean, and that's, you've got the Japhethic people living in even like towards the north, and the Hamitic people to the south, and the Semitic people in the middle. So the Semitic people kind of work as this bridge between the two groups. And I mean, that's always kind of how Israel served. It was always this bridge between the two worlds, between kind of Asia and Europe and Africa. And you get that with, you know, you got the Egyptians and the Hittites, the Egyptians and the Babylonians, the Egyptians and the Hittites, the Egyptians and the Assyrians, the Egyptians and the Babylonians, the Egyptians and the Persians, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. You always get this kind of Israel serving as this bridge between two different great powers. Really up until later when you get the Roman Empire really takes over. But then again, you even have like the Roman Empire and still the Persian Empire, and you kind of move beyond Egypt at that point, and then kind of after that you get Western Rome, Eastern Rome, Byzantine Empire, and stuff from there. But yeah, Israel for a long period of time, Israel and the Semitic peoples really served as this bridge between the Japhethic and the Hamitic peoples as well. They're kind of this just bridge between two worlds. And with that out of the way, let us get on with the actual studies here. Just before we go on, I mentioned, because the Arabian peoples, they descended from the Ishmaelites, the Edomites, the Midianites, and the Amalekites. They're Abrahamic peoples. But you also have the Ammonites and the Moabites, which were descended from Lot. So they are, again, Semitic peoples, but that's not Abrahamic peoples. The Moabites, they're the same kind of Semitic people. They're technically Hebrews because they're descended from Heber or Eber. So they are Hebraic peoples, but they're not Abrahamic peoples. And let's begin then with the first son of Shem, which is Elam. And he's the ancestor of the Elamites, and this is the ancestor of the Persians. And as I mentioned above, the Persians would later merge with the Japhethic Medes to form the Median-Persian Empire, or the Medo-Persian Empire, as it's sometimes also called. So you get Darius the Mede mentioned in the Bible. He's actually Japhethic, so he would have been lighter skinned. Whereas the Persians, I mean, they're Semitic people, so they wouldn't have been like dark skinned like the Ethiopians, but they would have been more that kind of middle brown Arabic skin tone, as the Elamites and the Persians were. Kind of like your more stereotypical Iranians, because most people don't realize that Iran as a country is kind of a mixed bag of ethnicities. You've got more your northern Iranians that are more connected with the Caucasus regions. They're much closer related to your Armenians and the people of Georgia and Azerbaijan and that area. And so that would be more your people of your Medes. And then in kind of southern Iran, you've got people that are more kind of Arabic, and these would be more your Persian peoples, your Elamites. And next you have Ashur or Assyria. Assyria, it's the same word in Hebrew. And so he's the ancestor of the Assyrians. So you got the Assyrian Empire that becomes a big enemy of Israel in the Old Testament. Next you have Arphaxad. Now Arphaxad is interesting because from Arphaxad is where we get the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans is kind of the broad term for the people in that Babylonian era. Because sometimes you always talk about the Babylonians and the Chaldeans. That's like trying to talk about like, I don't know, like Germans and Saxons. So Germanic peoples, kind of that whole German area, but then Saxons are specifically that one area. Chaldeans kind of referred to that whole area of Shinar, where the Babylonians were specifically the people of Babylon. They're the ones that kind of rose to power and established the Babylonian Empire, ruling over the other Chaldean people. Now, what is most interesting is that Abraham is actually a Chaldean by birth. Abraham is descended from Arphaxad, and the Chaldeans are descended from Arphaxad. So that means Abraham ethnically was a Chaldean. He's originally a Chaldean, and he's born in Ur of the Chaldeans. That's where he said. So Abraham by birth was a Chaldean. But later, Abraham moves to the land of Aram, and he has actually called himself an Aramean. And this is one thing that's interesting because the Bible refers to Abraham as a wandering Aramean, meaning that he came from Aram. But Abraham was not ethnically from Aram, because Aram is actually the fifth son of Shem. And Abraham is descended from Arphaxad, the third son of Shem. So this is interesting because it really gives an idea of citizenship and nationality in the scriptures. That Abraham, by birth, was a Chaldean, but identified in himself as an Aramean, because even though he was born in Chaldea, he later moved to Aram and changed his citizenship. He used to be a Chaldean, then he became an Aramean. And that's interesting because you get this then shifting of citizenship in the Bible, in this evidence of Abraham. This very goes much into nationality versus ethnicity. That you can be ethnically one group, but nationality can be different. So, like, you could be, like for me, ethnically, I'm descended from Germans and Danes and English. And particularly the English are the Anglo-Saxons, with themselves were Germanic peoples. The Danes, Scandinavians, they're Germanic peoples as well. So essentially, ethnically, I'm a Germanic person. We're going to go right back to the first Bible study. The Germanic peoples are from Ashkenaz, the firstborn son of Gomer, the firstborn son of Japheth. So ethnically, I'm an Ashkenazi. I'm a Germanic person, ethnically. But I was born in the nation of Australia, raised in the nation of Australia. I'm a citizen of Australia. Ethnically, I'm Germanic. Nationality, I'm Australian. And you see this with Abraham, who is ethnically Chaldean, but nationality identified himself as an Aramean. He was from Aram, because that's where he moved to and lived, and decided to identify himself as as a wandering Aramean. And this also leads into just a very interesting thing as well, when you start looking at these, when the Israelites had these conflicts with these greater empires. Because one of the biggest enemies of Israel became the Assyrian Empire. Now, what's interesting is that the Israelites are descended from Arphaxad, the third son of Shem. The Assyrians were descended from Ashur, or Assyria, the second son of Shem. So the Assyrians are essentially their distant cousins, attacking them. Then later, there's the Babylonian Empire that comes and conquers Judah. The Babylonians were descended from the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were descended from Arphaxad as well. So the Israelites and the Babylonians are both descendants of the Chaldeans. So they're even closer cousins. And then after that, you get the rise of the Persian Empire, and they're descended from the Elamites, and that's from the firstborn son of Shem. So again, you've got these cousins of the Israelites coming and ruling over Israel. It's only then after the Alexander's conquest of the Alexandrian Empire, where you now get the Greeks, which were descended from Javan, of the son of Japheth, that you now get Japhethic peoples ruling over Israel. So essentially, my point there is that you had originally Israel was the land of Canaan, inhabited by Canaanites, descendants of Ham, later got conquered by the Israelites, descended of Shem, later got conquered by Assyrians, descended from Shem, later got conquered by the Babylonians, descended from Shem, later conquered by Persians, descendants of Shem, later then conquered by Greeks, descendants of Japheth, later conquered by Romans, descended from Japheth. Then you kind of have the Byzantines, which are again Greeks and Europeans, and then eventually also you got the Arabs, which are descendants of Abraham as well, kind of descended from Abraham's other children. So, the hands went from the land of Canaan was originally Hamitic, then Semitic, then Semitic, then Semitic, then Semitic, then Japhethic, then Japhethic, then Semitic again. Very interesting. I mean, that's just the changing of hands. But the point I was trying to make there is that it's interesting when you read about the nation of Israel getting conquered by Assyria, Babylon, Persia, that these are essentially the cousins of the Israelites. That the Assyrians are distant cousins of the Israelites. The Babylonians are actually closer cousins to the Israelites than the Assyrians, and then the Persians are again more distant cousins. And so it's actually cousins. I mean, essentially, if you go back to the fact that that Shem and Japheth are brothers, and so when the Greeks invade, that they are also cousins of the Israelites. I mean, essentially, whenever any kind of nation fights another nation, because we're all descended from Noah, it's cousins fighting cousins, essentially. But the point I was trying to make is that it was closer cousins. Like, that when when the Assyrians were attacking Israel, that this is another Semitic group attacking them. And that when the Babylonians attacked, that actually the Babylonians and the Israelites are descended from Arpachshad. They are descended from the same son of Shem, from the third son of Shem. So these are even closer cousins. That the Babylonians and the Israelites are pretty close relatives. The fact that Abraham himself was a Chaldean by birth, born in Ur, and the Babylonians are Chaldeans born in Babylon. It's like really close cousins fighting each other. Essentially, you know, they've moved far apart. Like Abraham went from Ur to Aram down to the land of Canaan, so they're living far apart, but that their ancestors basically grew up in cities next to each other. That the Israelites' ancestors were like in a neighboring city to the Babylonians who came and conquered them. So I just find that interesting when you start actually figuring out how these people are all related. And also it's interesting that when you get to Esther marrying Ahasuerus, the Persian king, that the Persians were Elamites, they were Semitic people, so she's still marrying within that Semitic line. And later when you get at the end of the book of Esther, you get some Persians converting to Judaism. These are Semitic peoples as well, converting to Judaism. You probably also had, in the book of Daniel, you had some Babylonians converting to Judaism, and again, they're like just close cousins to the Israelites. And so I find that very interesting, and it's going to be interesting more when we get into the next when we talk about Joktan and the Indians, because Arpachshad, his oldest son, or at least the son that is mentioned, is Shalat. Now he may be the oldest son of Arpachshad, or he may just be mentioned because he's the one from which Abraham is descended from. Obviously Arpachshad had other sons, and they're not even mentioned. Arpachshad, who also probably had other sons, only one of his sons is mentioned, and that's Eber, or Heber in the Hebrew, from where we get the Hebrews. What's interesting here is, like I said, now I could assume that Shalah and Eber were the oldest sons of each other. Like Eber is the oldest son of Shalah, and Shalah is the oldest son of Arpachshad. But that's not necessarily the case. Because when you go through the genealogies, it says, like, you know, Shem was the father of Arpachshad, Arpachshad was the father of Shelah, Shelah was the father of Heber, Heber was the father of Peleg, and so forth and so forth. But we know from Genesis 10 that Arpachshad is actually the third son of Shem. So that genealogy from Shem to Abraham doesn't necessarily mean oldest son to oldest son to oldest son. It's just the son to the son to the son that ended up with Shem to Abraham. So we know that Arpachshad is the third son of Shem. So Shelah could be the first son of Arpachshad, or he could be the seventh son of Arpachshad. Same with Heber. Heber seems to have two sons mentioned, Peleg and Joktan. Now that could be his only two sons, or it could just be the two sons that are of most importance. Peleg is the ancestor of Abraham. His name means division, which means he's probably born during the age of division, just after the Tower of Babel incident, when people started to scatter and spread throughout the world. Peleg is the ancestor of Abraham. Abraham is the ancestor of all the Abrahamic peoples, including Israel, Ishmael, Abraham is the father of all the Abrahamic peoples, including the Israelites, the Ishmaelites, the Edomites, the Midianites, and the Amalekites. Peleg would also be the ancestor of the descendants of Lot, which would be the Ammonites and the Moabites as well. And so all those who inhabit the lands of Canaan or Israel and the land of Arabia would be descended from Peleg. And Peleg, so his ancestors, Peleg's descendants are the Jews and the Arabs. Now, during the age of the Islamic conquest, the Arabic peoples would spread out beyond Arabia, into North Africa, even as far into Spain in the east, in the west, sorry. So I'll just do that again. The the Arabic peoples spread from Arabia into North Africa as far west into Spain, and also eastward as far east as Indonesia. So yeah, the Abrahamic Semitic peoples really spread out, reaching from Spain in the west to Indonesia in the east. Also down into Africa, the Arabic peoples really spread into Africa, down to like Ghana and places like that. They established big kingdoms that were Arabic and not Hamitic. So they were actually Semitic peoples, not Hamitic peoples. And that really goes into the histories of the Islamic conquest and how far the Arabic peoples spread. So before the days of the European conquests, when the European empire spread out throughout the world, before that you had the age with the Islamic conquests, when the Islamic people, the Arabic people, spread throughout the world. Prior to that, you also had the spreading of Buddhism with Tibetan and Chinese people spreading throughout the world, and you also had Genghis Khan, and you had Attila the Hun and people like that, with the Mongolian peoples spreading out pretty far, all the way from Manchuria in the east all the way to Hungary in the west. Hungary being named after the Huns being connected with the Central Asian people. So, you've had these ages of expansion, generally through conquest. So, during the age of conquest with the European empires, you had, the Spaniards, the French, the British, and other European empires spreading throughout the globe. But before that, you had the Islamic conquests with the Arabic people spreading throughout the globe, and prior to that, you had the conquest of the Huns with them spreading throughout the globe. So you've had these ages of conquest in which people really spread out far and wide, and will be interesting to see what happens in the future, where we'll go next. But moving on to the next son is Joktan. And Joktan is an interesting person because Josephus declared that the children of Joktan inhabited the Kopan or Kabul River in India. Luther would also connect the children of Joktan with the Indians. Now, one of Joktan's sons was Havilah. Now, as mentioned in the last study, Josephus talks about a Hamitic Havilah, which he connected with the Berbers in North Africa and the area of the Sahara. And Josephus also talks about a Semitic Havilah, which he connects with the land of India. Josephus, when he talks about the Garden of Eden, declares that the river Pison mentioned in Genesis 2:11 is the river Ganges, and Genesis 2 says that the river Pison flowed throughout the land of Havilah, and Josephus says that the river Pison is the river Ganges and that the land of Havilah is the land of India. And this also seems to make a bit of sense historically, because you have Solomon, who it talks about Solomon getting gold from the land of Ophir, and Ophir is one of the other sons of Joktan, and historically there seems to be evidence that Solomon traded with the land of India. He got ships of Tarshish, this is like ships of Spain, and he took them across the land and he established a port city on the Gulf of Araba, which is part of the Red Sea, and he sent ships from there down around Arabia and eastward into the land of India. You'll get this later, the history of St. Thomas, that he went to India and he ran into people over there that were Jewish peoples that had been settlers in India from the days of Solomon, and they had were either direct descendants of the Jews that had sailed from Israel to India during the days of Solomon, / ones who'd been converted and intermarried, that you'd had these traders, these Israelite traders from the days of Solomon, it intermarried with with Indians there in the land of India, in the land of Havilah or the land of Ophir. So you have in Genesis 25:18, it talks about the Ishmaelites living between Havilah and Shur. And 1 Samuel 15:7 also talks about the Amalekites living between Shur and Havilah. Now Shur refers to a land south of Israel, kind of the north of the Sinai Peninsula. Now since we know the Ishmaelites and the Amalekites lived in Arabia, this could place Havilah in the east of Arabia, since Shur is in the west of Arabia. And thus the expression between Shur and Havilah could be a reference to the entire Arabian Peninsula. Now, Joktan's sons could be the many original Hindi tribes to inhabit the land of India. What is interesting though to consider is that Joktan is the ancestor of the Hindi peoples, but this means that the Indians were not only Semitic, but they were also Hebraic, descended from Eber or Heber. And we know again during the days of Solomon, ships from Israel sailed to India. During the days of the apostles, St. Thomas moved to India where he met people there who were Jews who claimed to have been descended from the traders of Solomon's day. And throughout history there seems to be this close tie between the Jews and the Indians. And that's quite interesting because I did this Bible, while at Shem, I did this big study into Hinduism, and what is interesting is that Hinduism does have a lot of very similar washing rituals to Judaism. So a lot of the same cleansing, washing rituals that you find in the Levitical Mosaic laws are also done in Hinduism. And so there seems to be this historic tie between Hindus and Jews. And this goes back all the way to Joktan, but again, the days of Solomon, the days of Thomas. And so it could be that there seems to be this similar connection between the two. And so it gives more weight to this suggestion from Luther and Josephus that the Indians are actually Semitic peoples. And it also makes sense logically when you have the Persians are Semitic peoples, and that kind of they all would have moved from the area of Babylon, and kind of moved eastward from Babylon into Persia, into India. So it kind of makes sense that they're all kind of descended from Shem, that they're all kind of interrelated. Though historically speaking, there is this event known as the Aryan invasion, or the Aryan immigration, or Aryan migration, in which Japhethic peoples from the Caucasus regions moved or invaded North India. Many scholars consider this to be less of an Aryan invasion and more of a Aryan migration, in which there was like a blending of cultures. Like, so there's this moving of Caucasian people into North India and kind of blending and intermarrying. I mean, it makes sense. You had the Medes and the Persians intermarrying and connecting together. Largely, the idea of the Aryan migration or the Aryan invasion has to do with the fact that there is this similarities between Germanic languages, Persian languages, and Sanskrit or your Hindi languages, that there does seem to be this kind of similarity in languages. And so there is this suggestion that there was this kind of migration of movement from, you know, the Caucasus region kind of spread out and kind of intermingled with the Persian peoples and the Indian peoples, and that there was this blending of cultures, because you then get like your Japanese and your Chinese languages being very different to your European languages, where there seems to be a lot more similarities between your Hindi, Sanskrit, Indian languages to your Persian languages, and connections between your Persian languages and your European languages. So it's a grammatical argument for this migration, because we don't really have much histories, apart from the fact that there does seem to be some Hindu references to this great war, and that would talk about the idea of an Aryan invasion. I did this in my study on Hinduism, that prior to the Islamic conquests of India, there seems to be this previous conquest from people in the north that came down from like the Caucasus regions and the steppe areas in Central Asia and kind of moved down and conquered North India. This kind of also explains that if you look at the ethnic divide and makeup of India now, there is this very big difference between your North Indian Hindis and your South Indian Dravidian peoples, your Sri Lankans and your North Indians. There seems to be this big divide between the two. I mean, part of that does stem from the Islamic conquest when the Arabs and like your Pakistanians, as they are today, kind of controlled India. But there is also, before that, there was this group of people in the Caucasus regions and that also invaded north of India. I mean, you also had like the Genghis Khan and the Huns and people like that also invade down into north of India. So North India kind of is a bit of a I don't know, a melting pot of ethnicities. There seems to just be this mix of your original Hindus, your Caucasians, your Arabs, your steppes, your Chinese, your Asian cultures, your Tibetans. There seems to just be this massive mix in that kind of North Indian area. And it's just to do with the general history of different rising and falling of empires. So even before you get like the British Mandate and the Brits coming and colonizing India kind of has this history of invasions and colonizations. I mean, Alexander the Great got to the outreaches of India and started conquering parts of North India. So there's just this historic kind of conflict area in North India. I mean, it's similar to like the Middle East. There just seems to always been historically these different rising and falling of empires. You have the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Seleucids, the Assadians, the Romans, there's just the Ottomans. There's just like this constant changing of hands in that kind of Arabian, Anatolia, South Caucasus, North India region. It's like it's really like the center of humanity. It kind of all the empires seem to be fighting in that area. And I mean, it kind of makes sense when you think of the fact that Noah, the ark landed on Mount Ararat in the South Caucasus regions. That kind of area would be a hotbed of humanity. It just seems to be this ongoing activity in those areas, the rising and falling of empires, migrations, colonization, conquests, famines, genocides, everything. It's always changing hands. And so really trying to pin down what ethnicity and who's descended from who there is very difficult. Intermarrying is also a big thing that happens as well. So it's not like you can say, oh, these people are Semitic, these people are Hamitic, these people are Japhethic, because there was a lot of migrations and conquests and assimilations and intermarrying going on. That area is kind of just a melting pot of ethnicities, and it is really a mixture of all peoples in that area. And I think that's interesting, that there is kind of this history in that area where they have for thousands of years been changing hands and mixing and intermarrying, and you can't really break it down to who's descended from who, because everyone there is kind of descended from everyone. I mean, there's this idea that, like, you know, what is it, like a quarter of people or more are descended from Attila the Hun or from Genghis Khan. I forget which one. I think it's Genghis Khan, like, and I forget the exact number. It's like, you know, a quarter of people in the world are descended from Genghis Khan because he had that many wives and he controlled that big of an area and he, you know, conquered that many different people. I mean, you also take in the fact that Alexander the Great did this as well, and there'd be so many people that would be descended from Alexander the Great as well. So that's just a mixing pot of of races and ethnicities in that area. And so, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting side topic as well. I mean, we're talking here, this Bible study is really talking about who is descended from who from the tower, who is descended from who from the descendants of Noah. And I think the reality is that everybody kind of mixed everywhere. And while you can kind of give, like, you know, kind of broad, like, these people are Japhethic, these people are Hamitic, these people are Semitic, there's kind of, everybody's connected to everybody. And so you can't really just break it down into a fine distinction as like, okay, well, these people are only Japhethic, these people are only Hamitic, these people are only Semitic. I mean, for example, just after the flood in general, like the sons and the daughters of Ham, Shem, and Japheth would have intermarried with each other. This actual breaking down of different races is something that happened post the Tower of Babel. And it's only kind of, it was part of the curse of Babel that we were to divide, that we were to be separated. And it's kind of the blessing of Pentecost, when God gave the apostles the ability to speak all these different languages, to speak in tongues, so they could go forth into the outreach, not only into the extent of the Roman Empire, but beyond the Roman Empire. You have, according to tradition, St. Matthew going down to Ethiopia, St. Thomas going all the way to India, other apostles going up into the Germanic regions. You know, the apostles not only filled the Roman Empire, they went beyond the Roman Empire. And they took God's message beyond the reaches of Jerusalem to everyone. And they spread God's word to all peoples. So that the church can be made up of peoples of every nation, of every tribe, of every tongue. I mean, it's interesting to stop and think about the Council of Nicaea. At the Council of Nicaea, you had like 300 plus bishops show up. And amongst these bishops, you had guys like St. Athanasius, who was ethnically an Ethiopian. You got St. Augustine, who was ethnically a Berber from North Africa. You had Basil, who was ethnically Italian. You had St. Nicholas, who was ethnically a Greek. You had all these people gathered together at the Council of Nicaea to discuss theology. And guess what? They didn't see colour. They didn't see race. They didn't care about this stuff, because we're all made in the image of God. We're all descended from Abraham. Sorry. We're all descended from Adam. And we're all descended from Noah. Whether you're Japhethic, Semitic, Hamitic, you're all descended from Noah, and by extension, all descended from Adam. We're all one people. We're all essentially one race, the human race. We may have different ethnicities. Like the Greek word ethnicity, ethnos, just means peoples. We may be from different people groups, but we're all one race, the human race. And at the Council of Nicaea, they didn't divide people based on ethnicity. They didn't divide people based on skin tone. The Council of Nicaea divided people based on doctrine. Were you a Bible-believing Christian, or were you a heretic? That's what the Council of Nicaea divided on. It didn't matter whether Arius wasn't an Arian. Arius was from Alexandria. It didn't matter whether what race Arius was. The problem was, Arius was a heretic who denied the divinity of Christ. It didn't matter whether Athanasius was from Ethiopia or Augustine was from North Africa, from Carthage. Hippo, but around the area of Carthage. It didn't matter that Basil was from the area of Milan in North Italy. It didn't matter that Nicholas was from Myra in the Anatolia Greek areas. It didn't matter where they came from. These guys all agreed that Jesus Christ was God. They all agreed that there are three persons of the Trinity. They all agreed on the scriptures. And that's what's most important. It doesn't matter whether you're Japhethic, Hamitic, Semitic. Doesn't matter whether you're black, white, brown. Doesn't matter whether you're German, Spanish, Ethiopian, Arabian, Chinese, Australian, American. Doesn't matter. What's important is that we are all sons of God. That we're all sons of Adam. That we're all made in the image of God. That we all hold to the Word of God. That's what is important. And just to wrap up the summary, we should actually probably finish up with the other sons of Shem. The fourth son of Shem is Lud. He's connected with the Lydians. These were the original inhabitants of Western Anatolia. And the fifth and final son of Shem is Aram, from where we get the Arameans. And he has four sons that are mentioned. Uz is the land where Job lived. This is connected with northwest Mesopotamia. There is Hul. This is the region in southern Syria. It is probably from Hul where you get the ancestors of Aram, Damascus. So sometimes you'll see in the Bible, in the newer translations like your NIV, it will say Syria. In your older translations of the Bible, like your King James Version, it'll say Aram, Damascus. That was the actual name of that kingdom. They're probably descended from Hul, the son of Aram. Then you have Gether. According to Josephus, Gether is the founder of the Bactrians. These are essentially the ancestors of the Afghans in Afghanistan. And then the last son of Aram is Mash or Meshech. Josephus connects him with the Messenians, located on the top of the Persian Gulf. This would place them in the same area of the Chaldeans, or the descendants of Arpachshad. So, in summary, Shem's descendants spread along the Tigris and the Euphrates, westward into Anatolia, eastward into Persia, and even as far as India. Later, they would spread throughout the regions of Arabia and possibly take away the Arabian Peninsula from the original inhabitants of the Hamitic peoples, in the same way that the Israelites would eventually conquer the land of Canaan, which was originally inhabited by Hamitic peoples as well. And that kind of wraps up this study. I just wanted to wrap up this study by, again, we've talked a lot about race and ethnicity here, and I tried to make this point clear that race and ethnicity is not important. What is important is whether you believe the gospel. And this is seen not only in the New Testament, but even in the Old Testament. You had the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, were the chosen people of God. Yet, people were brought in to this people of God, not by ethnicity, but by faith. You had Uriah the Hittite. The Hittites were Canaanite people. They came and he lived amongst the people. He became a faithful servant of David, a faithful believer in God. You have Rahab, the prostitute. She was a Canaanite, an ancestor of King David. She married into the Israelite people. She too became a believer in God. You have Ittai, the Gittite. The Gittites were people of Gath, and they were the Philistines. They too were Hamitic peoples, and Ittai became one of the most loyal servants and followers of David, to the fact that he became one of David's generals during the civil war between David and his son Absalom. So you have all these Canaanite people, and all these Hamitic peoples assimilating into the Israelites. They became believers in God. You later have Persians and Babylonians that convert and become believers, and later, then when you get to the New Testament, you get Greeks and Romans, and Ethiopians and people from all over becoming Christian. And that's the point I want to end on. You know, we've talked a lot about race and ethnicity in this Bible study because we're looking at the Table of Nations and how people spread out from the Ark and Mount Ararat and how they inhabited the land and where different people groups originally settled. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. Because in the end, we're children of God. And what is important is the gospel. As Luther said, as I mentioned in the first Bible study, when Luther talks about the Germanic peoples being descended from Ashkenaz, the firstborn son of Gomer, the firstborn son of Japheth, who is possibly the firstborn son of Noah. And Luther says, look, the fact that the Germans are descended from the firstborn of the firstborn of the firstborn of the firstborn of Noah doesn't give them a reason to boast. Their ethnic line is nothing to boast in. Doesn't matter if they're the firstborn of the firstborn of the firstborn of Noah. That's not a reason to boast. What a reason to boast is that we have received the gospel. And that's what Luther says. He doesn't boast in the fact that he's a German. He boasts in the fact that he's a Christian. And that is the point that I want to end on. That is the thing that I want everybody to focus on. Don't boast that you're a German, or an English, or Australian, or American, or Chinese, or Japanese, or Nigerian, or Ethiopian, or Brazilian, or anywhere else. Boast in the fact that you're a Christian. And I think that's the thing. You always see people like, I'm proud to be American, I'm proud to be African, I'm proud to be European, I'm proud to be anything. No. Be proud to be a Christian. Boast not in your race. Boast not in your ethnicity. Boast in the fact that you are a Christian, that you're a believer, that you're justified by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. If you boast in anything, boast in Christ. Amen. And that wraps up this Bible study series on the Table of Nations. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series. And, you know, stay tuned to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel for more Bible studies. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.